necessary to destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is now time for the Thursday night live stream. And I'm very happy that everybody has joined me and is not watching the main event. Apparently, the main event, as far as CNN is concerned, is the inauguration of the Obama Presidential Center. So CNN has given over the entirety of the day to coverage, exclusively coverage of the opening of the Obama Presidential Center, which of course looks absolutely hideous. The idea that you have a cable news network, and this is its idea of news, well, that tells you everything you need to know about CNN. So anyway, there are a few things to discuss. Obviously, there's the memorandum of understanding, which has now been published and which has now been signed by the President of the United States and the President of Iran, and that'll be a kind of a formal signing as things stand. We still cannot be sure of that exactly, but as things stand, there will be a formal signing in Switzerland, and so. Then we get to the hard part of it. Now, obviously, I mean, there are obviously several ways of responding to this, and of course, naturally, everyone is jumping up and down, very, very excited about this defeat and humiliation for the United States. Obviously, because the memorandum of understanding doesn't include any of the original objectives as spelled out by Trump originally on February the 28th and in the immediate aftermath, or by Netanyahu also after February the 28th. So everything that was demanded, and originally the goal was the removal of the regime of the Ayatollahs. I mean, Trump was quite explicit about that on February the 28th. So that's gone by the wayside. And then subsequently, when he talked about unconditional surrender, well, that hasn't happened. And the removal of ballistic missiles, that hasn't happened. And the abandonment of regional allies, that also has been abandoned. So there's none of that in the memorandum of understanding. Now, so you can say, oh, well, this has been a huge defeat for the United States. And in a sense, it has been. I mean, if you don't accomplish your original goals, then that counts that you have lost. However, I do think that one should give credit where credit is due, which is that Trump realized very early on that this war was a huge mistake. He had been sold a bill of goods, or he had deluded himself, or he was so full of hubris after the successful removal of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela. He was so overwhelmed by his own sense of omnipotence that he decided he could do anything in Iran. He would succeed where all the predecessors, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama, they all failed. He will be able to remove the Ayatollahs from Tehran. So doubtless he thought that, but very quickly he changed his mind. And I think one always has to acknowledge that those leaders who, once they realize that they've made a mistake, they get themselves out of it. They immediately say, right, abort, abandon this plan and then let's try something different. And I think that is very important. I think Trump realized that very, very quickly, almost certainly within days of the start of Operation Epic Fury, and sought to get out of this. And of course, he did get out of it on April the 8th when he signed his the ceasefire, which is more or less held since then. And now with this memorandum of understanding, so he's got himself out of this war, and that is definitely an advance on let's say his predecessors who went on in Afghanistan for many, many, many years, some 20 years, from the fall of 2001 with George W. Bush all the way through to, pretty much late summer of 2021 with Biden. It was 20 years the United States waged a completely pointless war in Afghanistan. And of course, we had the years of Vietnam, which again dragged on year in, year out, even though almost all presidents recognized, Johnson, Nixon, they all recognized that this is a huge mistake, that there are no vital American interests here. There's not going to be an easy victory, and we need to find some way out of it. But getting out of it was always very difficult. I mean, it took years of negotiations for Johnson and Nixon finally to extract the United States from Vietnam, and then the withdrawal from Afghanistan was, of course, also extremely difficult. In the case of Iraq, the United States is still in Iraq. Now, Trump kind of realized that this is a huge blunder. The United States isn't going to accomplish any of its goals in Iran, and so he sought a way out of it. And I should also say, and I've said this here before, that Russia should have realized also in the case of Ukraine that whatever the objectives, and I always thought Russia's war aims in Ukraine in 2022 were entirely reasonable. I think Russia was in a very difficult position with NATO expansion and the obvious imminent NATO move into Ukraine, and that did pose a very serious strategic challenge for Russia, and that Russia had to do something. However, once it became clear that a military victory in those circumstances was not attainable, then it was time to abort and think of a different plan. And that avoids you from continuing a war, which is very heavy in lives and doesn't look like it's going to come to any kind of successful conclusion anytime soon. So I think that you have to give, yes, the initial decision on February the 28th was Trump's decision. It was a foolish decision, and he has to bear responsibility for making that foolish decision. However, to Trump's credit, he realized very quickly it was a foolish decision and set about disentangling the United States from that. And I think he's done that. I think he has managed to disentangle the United States from this debacle. What happens now, of course, is indeed very, very difficult to foresee, because I will go through the 14 points. I have difficulties believing that the United States will fulfill those points. For the United States to do those things, the United States will have to act in ways that it has never acted before. And, it's not in the United States' character to act in those ways. And in particular, coming up with some money for Iran. I don't think the United States is going to come up with any money for Iran. But more seriously, I don't think the United States will permit Iran to charge fees for the Strait of Hormuz, whatever they call them. Yeah, they won't call them tolls; they'll call them fees, environmental fees, or whatever. I don't think the United States will tolerate that, and then once they don't tolerate that, and then the United States starts imposing sanctions on countries and vessels that do pay Iran money. And that's what I think they will do, because any money that is given to Iran for the right of passage through the Strait of Hormuz, they'll say, well, that's going to the IRGC. The IRGC is a sanctioned entity. So you're giving money to a sanctioned entity. Therefore, you are under sanctions and you have to pay us a lot of money. That's going to keep out most of the world's shippers. They don't want to get sanctioned by the United States, and I think it'll keep out most of the countries, and that's very soon going to lead to some kind of a crisis. So I have my doubts that this is going to work, but it's a way of at least kicking the can down the road, bringing the kinetic part of the war to an end. Anyway, let's just take a look first of all at the 14 points, the Iran 14 points, and here it is. It's this one version published in the New York Times. Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding between the United States of America and Islamic Republic of Iran. And here's the first paragraph, which is very interesting. The United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran and their allies in the current war, by signing this MOU, declare the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. And so now, right away, one has to note that this agreement only refers to the United States and Iran. Now, the United States joined this fight alongside Israel. Israel was the United States' partner. So, but the agreement really has there's no Israeli input in this agreement. And so it says to declare this war, termination on all fronts, including Lebanon. Well, this is a little baffling, because Israel is Israel is really at the heart of the fighting in Lebanon. Iran has been involved in the fighting in Lebanon because of Israeli attacks on Hezbollah. So as long as Israel is not bound by any of this, and that's what Israel has said, it's not bound by this, and certainly isn't bound by anything in Lebanon, because it says it has the right to retaliate. Of course, that's Israel always says that. Then, that's obviously a huge gaping hole in this agreement right away. How can you have a termination of military operations in Lebanon if Israel is going to continue waging war in Lebanon? Anyway, and undertake from now on not to initiate any war or any military operation against each other, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against each other, and ensuring the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon. The final deal will confirm the permanent termination of the war on all fronts, including in Lebanon, and other provisions in this paragraph. Now, so you can see here that Lebanon is mentioned 3 times in the very first paragraph, which is quite striking. This is paragraph 1. Lebanon is mentioned 3 times, and yet the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is Israel's involvement, isn't mentioned at all. So it's hard to see how that is feasible. The other parts of it, I think, are quite interesting, because the United States essentially here is signing a non-aggression treaty with Iran. I mean, saying, well, that we declare immediate, permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, um, and not to initiate any war or any military operation against each other. So this was what Iran wanted all along. Iran wanted a commitment to no war, no, and so therefore this is the non-aggression pact that Iran was seeking, and they got it from the United States. Now, paragraph 2: the United States and Islamic Republic of Iran undertake to respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and to refrain from interfering in each other's internal affairs. Which of course, if if this was seriously adhered to, would be a major concession by the United States, because of course the United States has been interfering in the internal affairs of Iran really pretty much since the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. Anyway, paragraph 3: the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran commit to negotiating and achieving the final deal in maximum of 60 days, extendable with mutual consent. Okay, well, one has to assume that as long as the negotiations are continuing, then it can easily be extended, because it's absurd to think that any of this can be resolved. And there's a lot of issues to be resolved. I mean, there's obviously the nuclear issue, which has to be resolved within the next 60 days. But then, of course, there's also the issue of the right of passage in the Strait of Hormuz. That also has to be resolved. So there's a lot of negotiations necessary, and 60 days is very small. But nonetheless, there is the stipulation of paragraph 1, which is non-aggression treaty. So essentially, the United States is committing itself to not behaving in the way that it behaved last year in June 2025, when it launched an attack on Iran whilst negotiations were taking place in Oman, and then of course in February of this year, while negotiations were taking place in Geneva. Anyway, so that's paragraph 3. And then paragraph 4 says, immediately upon the signing of this MOU, and the United States will begin the removal of its naval blockade and any disturbances or impediments against the Islamic Republic of Iran. So that should already be taking place, because the MOU has been signed. So the removal of the naval blockade, any disturbances or impediments against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and we fully will fully end the naval blockade within 30 days. During this period, the traffic of vessels will be in proportion to the numbers of pre-war traffic being restored by the Islamic Republic of Iran. The United States of America further undertakes to remove its forces from the proximity of the Islamic Republic of Iran within 30 days after the final deal. So undertakes to remove, well, here you can see that commitment. The United States undertakes to remove its forces from the proximity of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So it's an interesting what they mean by proximity. One has to assume that what they mean by proximity are the forces that were brought into the Persian Gulf since the United States began threatening military action against Iran. So I don't think it means the removal of U.S. forces from Kuwait and Bahrain and Qatar, though people will want to read it in that way, but I don't think that's what it means. But in any case, those forces will not be removed until 30 days have elapsed since the signing of the final deal, not this MOU, the final deal. So that therefore the forces, in other words, the threat to use military force against Iran will stay in place until the final deal is signed. Okay, that's paragraph 5. Paragraph 4, paragraph 5 says, upon the signing of this MOU, the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge for 60 days, only from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman and vice versa. So this is very, very important. It says the Islamic Republic of Iran, upon the signing of this MOU, which has now been done, will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge for 60 days, only from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman and vice versa. The traffic of commercial vessels will immediately start, and considering the need for removing the technical and military obstacles and demining of the Islamic Republic of Iran will be instated within 30 days. The Islamic Republic of Iran will conduct dialogue with the Sultanate of Oman to define the future administration and maritime services in the Strait of Hormuz in discussion with other Persian Gulf littoral states in line with the applicable international law and the sovereign rights of coastal states in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, as I said, many people are getting very, very excited by this and saying that, oh, the United States has somehow agreed that Iran will charge fees on shipping going through the Strait of Hormuz. There's no indication the United States has agreed to this, and I don't think the United States will agree to this. Um, I mean, they just simply say, there'll be negotiations with Oman about administration of the Strait of Hormuz, but there's no mention there of any kind of fees, well, let alone tolls. No one's even going to talk about tolls. And there is an issue. I mean, it's understandable why Iran might want to charge administrative fees, but it is an international waterway, and you're not supposed to charge fees for passage through international waterways. Artificial, man-made waterways like the Suez Canal and Panama Canal, that's a different matter because somebody built those waterways, and therefore they're entitled to charge fees for them. But natural waterways like the Strait of Hormuz, the Dardanelles, the Strait of Malacca, they're just natural waterways, and you can't charge for them. So I think it's going to be very difficult for Iran to push forward. I think the United States has just simply has kicked the can down the road on that. They didn't want to argue about this at this stage, something that can be negotiated later. But I think that if Iran does go ahead with that, then they could be setting themselves up for the next war, because I think that's going to be a difficult one for the United States and the rest of the world to accept. And I think that if they did go ahead and start charging for the Strait of Hormuz, the United States will have a relatively easy time of it to rally other countries to the cause that we've got to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, and then they would push forward to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, so to make sure that nobody charges a fee. So we'll see about that. But there's nothing in that stipulation that suggests the United States has accepted Iran's right to charge administrative environmental fee. Anyway, paragraph 6. The United States undertakes with regional partners to develop a definitive, mutually agreed plan with at least 100, $300 billion for the reconstruction and economic development of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This seems to me the most dubious of of all, everything that's been said. Now, it could have something to do with the unfreezing of assets. Um, but Trump seemed to be suggesting the United States isn't going to cough up a penny of its own money. So the United States isn't going to put any money into this reconstruction fund. The mechanism for the implementation of this plan will be finalized as part of the final deal within 60 days. All required licenses, waivers, and permissions needed for the relevant financial transactions will be granted by the United States. Um, and then again, and I think it's like, say, the regional partners, but I don't think the regional partners will be much in the mood to put very much into the kitty for reconstruction of Iran, because some of them say, "Hey, I think Iran should be giving us money to for reconstruction." So I don't think they're going to be much inclined to put up much money. Anyway, paragraph 7. Here, this is again a very doubtful whether the United States is going to fulfill this. The United States of America undertakes to terminate all types of sanctions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, including UN Security Council resolutions, IAEA Board of Governors resolutions, and all unilateral US sanctions, primary and secondary, in an agreed upon schedule as part of the final deal. The Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States acknowledge the critical importance of the sanctions termination issue above mentioned and express their intention to immediately address these issues in the negotiations in order to achieve mutual agreement on them. Now, there are all sorts of big problems here. Now, the easiest ones to lift would be the UN Security Council resolutions, because once you adopt, and that's going to be one of the points of this memorandum, a UN Security Council resolution. Once you adopt that, then of course the UN Security Council resolutions will be removed. That isn't a problem. IAEA Board of Governors resolutions, that also shouldn't be a problem. But the US sanctions are quite difficult. Some of the sanctions have been imposed by Congress. There's all sorts of congressional legislation. I mean, and some of them are just simply executive decisions. Some of them are based on congressional legislation. And there's a whole web of these sanctions. It's because some of them refer to, say, the IRGC. Some of them have something to do with Hezbollah. Some of them, have to do with the nuclear issue. So some of them have to do with human rights abuses. So what the United States has done over the years is that they've kind of introduced layer upon layer upon layer of sanctions against Iran, but against other countries as well, that it actually becomes very, very difficult to remove them, because a lot of them just refer to very different kinds of issues. So, you can say, okay, well, we're going to remove all of them, but anything that requires the agreement of Congress, well, you can forget that. Congress isn't going to go along with that. So it's a nice idea, but as far as I can see, the only this will be the same as the sanctions under Obama, when Obama was also able to remove the UN Security Council resolution sanctions, but but he didn't remove the U.S. government sanctions. And anyway, then paragraph 8, the Islamic Republic of Iran reaffirms that it shall not procure or develop nuclear weapons. The United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran have agreed to resolve the disposition. Agreed to resolve. No, they haven't agreed on the disposition. They've just agreed to resolve the disposition of stockpiled enriched material pursuant to a mechanism that will be mutually agreed upon in accordance with the schedule mentioned in paragraph 7, with the minimum methodology to be down blending on site under the supervision of the IAEA. The two parties also agreed to discuss the issue of enrichment and other mutually agreed matters related to the Islamic Republic of Iran's nuclear needs based on the statutory framework being agreed upon in the final deal. The final deal will confirm the provisions of this paragraph. The United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran will acknowledge the critical importance of the nuclear issues above mentioned and express their intention to immediately address these issues in the negotiation in order to achieve mutual agreement on them. So, if you look at that, what they're saying here is that they're going to agree on disposing of this, this huge mass of enriched uranium, and they say they work out the schedule, down blending on site under the supervision of the IAEA. So all the Trumpian talk that they're going to hand it over to the United States, that hasn't been agreed upon. And then the two parties also agreed to discuss the issue of enrichment and other mutually agreed matters related to the Iran's nuclear needs. So they haven't ruled. You can see it hasn't been ruled out that Iran may, at some point, enrich. Now, then the question is obviously, will there be a moratorium on enrichment? But in principle, there's nothing here saying zero enrichment. It says they will discuss the issue of enrichment and other mutually agreed matters related to the Islamic Republic of Iran's nuclear needs based on the statutory framework being agreed upon in the final deal. And so in other words, the principle of enrichment is still there. I mean, that Iran may be permitted to enrich, but there's also no mention here, as there was in the JCPOA, about shipping the material out. So it's essentially, it'll be down blending on site. So the down blending will take place in Iran under the supervision of the IAEA. This is paragraph 9, pending the final deal, the United States and Iran agree to maintain the status quo. Islamic Republic of Iran will maintain the current status quo of its nuclear program, and the United States will not impose any new sanctions and will not deploy additional forces in the region. Okay, so no more threats. That era is gone, continually threatening Iran. The United States, this is paragraph 10, the United States of America undertakes that immediately upon the signing of this MOU and until the termination of sanctions, U.S. Department of Treasury will issue waivers for the export of Iranian crude oil. So that's important, petroleum products and derivatives. So in other words, undertakes that immediately upon the signing of the MOU, which has happened, and until the termination of the sanctions, which obviously hasn't happened yet, the Treasury Department will issue waivers for the export of Iranian crude oil. So now Iran, in theory, should be able to export its crude and petroleum products and derivatives and all associated services, including banking transactions, insurances, transportation, etc. So essentially, though the sanctions on oil sales have been lifted. Paragraph 11. The United States of America undertakes to make fully available for use the frozen or restricted funds and assets of the Islamic Republic of Iran upon the implementation of this MOU. So, upon the implementation, so to make fully available. So that's the question of what exact when and what exactly that means. The United States and Iran will mutually agree on the procedures related to the release of these funds during the negotiations. Um, well, also they don't really specify which set of frozen funds because there are a lot of different kinds of frozen funds. There's some frozen funds that are in the Middle East. There's frozen funds in the United States, so that's left somewhat in the air. Such funds, whether retained in the original account or transferred, shall be made fully usable for payment to a beneficiary designed by the Central Bank of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So that's quite an extraordinary allowance there. Such funds, whether retained in the original account or transferred, shall be made fully usable for payment to any ultimate beneficiary designated by the Central Bank of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So they pretty much, it sounds like they can pretty much pay anyone that they want. The United States undertakes to issue all necessary licenses and authorizations accordingly. And paragraph 12, United States and Iran agree that an executive mechanism will be established to monitor the successful implementation of this MOU and the future compliance of the final deal. Paragraph 13, after signing this MOU, subject to the beginning of paragraphs 1, 5, and the continuing implementation of these measures, the United States and Iran will start negotiations regarding the final deal exclusively on the other paragraphs. And then paragraph 14, the final deal will be endorsed by a binding UN Security Council resolution. All right, so you can see here that as you know, that if in terms of the goals that that the United States had set, those goals have gone. Iran certainly has walked away with its head held high. But of course, now it becomes the difficult issues, because for Iran, the real accomplishments will be the lifting of sanctions and the disposal of the frozen assets, because Iran badly needs its money. Iran is still a very poor country. It's had to endure decades of sanctions, so it wants this money. I don't think the nuclear issue is that big a deal any longer. I mean, I think they've seen what they're capable of doing. But the for the United States, they can more or less, Trump can more or less say, hey, look, I mean, what we really ever said. And here you can see Trump's essential cunning, because whenever, at least after the first few days, whenever he talked about, well, what are your objectives? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? He would just simply say, oh, well, Iran must not have a nuclear weapon. So if that's what you wanted to accomplish, then of course you've accomplished that. Though it's no big deal, because Iran has always said, we have no interest in procuring, developing, or whatever nuclear weapons. So, but that's enough for Trump to say, okay, well, the United States has achieved what it wanted to achieve. Now, where that becomes very problematic is, well, Israel, because Israel wanted something very different. Israel wanted not just regime change, not just the removal of the Islamic government in Tehran. It wanted something more. It wanted the collapse of Iran. It wanted the breakup of Iran. It wanted Iran essentially to be, riven by civil war, riven by all sorts of ethnic, religious factions. Minorities insisting on their irredentist claims and whatever. So this agreement obviously is a real problem for Israel, because as things stand, and whether this is feasible, whether this can work, as I say, particularly with the issue of the sanctions on the U.S. side, frozen assets, I think that can probably be done. I think that's an easy one. The sanctions are going to be very difficult. And then, depending on how Iran plays the Strait of Hormuz, these are all things that could become a problem. But for Israel, as they see it, Iran comes out of this much stronger than it was going in. It's going to get a lot of money, as right? Sanctions are going to be lifted. It'll get its hands on its own assets. But, and even more seriously, Iran, its reputation has been enormously enhanced in the eyes of the world. It had two nuclear powers attacking it, pummeling it, day in, day out. And it withstood these attacks. And it showed itself to be very, very resourceful, very, very clever in its diplomacy. It withstood the elimination of its leadership on day one, but even successive leaders were assassinated. So it withstood all of that. And Iran now, for the first time, really, in decades, certainly for the first time ever since the revolution of '79, Iran now enjoys great prestige in the world. Israel, on the other hand, its prestige is in the toilet. So Israel, and we know this from experience, isn't going to sit still for that, and is going to try and do whatever it can to damage Iran, and above all, to ensure that this ceasefire, this agreement, the negotiations all fail abysmally, and that the United States will resume its war on Iran. And Trump seemed to understand this during his news conference in Evian yesterday, where he made swipe after swipe against Netanyahu. So let's just watch a little bit of the things that Trump said yesterday. So let's first watch this.
And in all fairness to Bibi Netanyahu, who happens to be a good man, gets a little excited sometimes. But he happens to be a very good man. We've had an amazing partnership. He's been an amazing prime minister. We have a little dispute over Lebanon. I say, you can do a little softer touch, Bibi. You don't have to knock down a building every time somebody walks into it that's from Hezbollah.
You don't have to knock down a building the moment anyone walks into it who's supposedly Hezbollah. That's quite a statement. I mean, because this is the guy. I mean, we know this is exactly what Israel does. I mean, we've known this for years, and successive U.S. presidents have always ignored this. But there he says, yeah, This is what Israel does. It just simply knocks down a building, where families live because somebody or other who is believed to be Hezbollah, again, believed to be Israel claims it's Hezbollah, and then you just knock down the building and kill everybody who's in the building.
But it's been an amazing partnership. But he will say, we're the big partner and he's the very small partner, and that's true. So
we're the big partner, he's a very small partner. So you gotta know your place. You gotta know your place.
he came to the country and he begged Barack Hussein Obama, the president, not to do the JCPOA. He said it could be the end of Israel, and it would have been if I didn't come along. And Obama didn't listen to him. Bibi actually went to Congress and pleaded with them, and he got nowhere. And they had this horrible deal. It was horrible for Israel, and that's where it stood. And then I came along and I terminated that deal. It had very little time left. It was a short-term deal. With countries, you need hundreds of years. You don't need 8 years and 9 years. This isn't like you're signing a lease on a candy store in the corner. You need hundreds of years. This was a short-term lease. It expired long ago. Had I let it run, it expired. You wouldn't have been around. A lot of people wouldn't have been around. But Israel would have been terminated. I think the whole Middle East would have been terminated. You saw that when everybody was shocked that all these missiles, they were aimed at the...
All right, so this is familiar stuff from him, but then he comes back in a little bit to Bibi. Let's take a look.
You released the agreement, and we did send a copy to Israel, by the way. They've been a good partner. Again,
notice we sent a copy to Bibi. We sent him a copy. This is a war jointly launched by the United States and Iran. Jointly launched by United States and Israel against Iran. But then we negotiated this entirely without Israel. Israel didn't take any part in the negotiations. We negotiated entirely with Iran. And then we sent him a copy. We just faxed over a copy of the agreement. Not because we cared about his input, not because he had any power to change the terms of the agreement. The agreement's a done deal. So he was given no power to change anything, but we sent him a copy. So just to keep him informed about it. I mean, imagine just simply saying that, well, we just sent him a copy.
I think they could do better with respect to Hezbollah. I'm not saying they shouldn't protect themselves. I'm saying when 2 drones are shot into the desert and drop harmlessly, you don't have to knock down buildings in Beirut. They could behave better. And frankly, they could do a better job. I love them as a partner. They were terrific. But they could do a much better job with Hezbollah. On that, I don't think they're doing well. And I feel very bad for Lebanon. Lebanon's been, it was a great culture. They had the...
Now, this is very interesting because he comes back again and again to the subject of Lebanon. Trump's daughter, Tiffany, recently married a man who comes from a kind of prominent Lebanese family, a kind of Lebanese Christian family. I'm not sure whether it's a Lebanese Maronite Christian family or a Lebanese Greek Orthodox family. But nonetheless, that's, I think, one of the reasons why Trump seems to have become quite interested in Lebanon. And he brings up this issue again and again of the destructive policies that Israel is pursuing in Lebanon. but here again, he's saying that, well, it's really, this is really destructive. But he also knows that this is where, where one of the weaknesses of this agreement will be, well, Lebanon, because if Israel says, "Well, we're going to go on fighting against Hezbollah," then Trump knows Iran isn't going to sit still for repeated Israeli attacks on Hezbollah and repeated Israeli attacks on Beirut. Now, the question is, well, what happens then? What happens if Israel attacks Hezbollah and then Iran, as it did a few days ago, retaliates against Israel? Now, if Trump went then to say to Netanyahu, well, you're on your own. We told you, and here, and he's kind of saying it obliquely, but he's saying it in this news conference, that really you could do a better job with Hezbollah. You could actually, fight better. You can be a lot less destructive than you have been. Is he going to say that and say, you know what, you're on your own facing Hezbollah, or rather facing Iran? We're not going to get involved. Now, that could happen, but you'd have to think that the way Washington works, that if Iran and Israel start exchanging missile strikes against each other, then the pressure is going to grow on Trump or whoever is the U.S. president to come in on Israel's side. So ultimately, it's going to depend on Trump or his successors, or whether they're going to be firm enough to tell Israel, you know what, you're on your own facing Iran. You're gonna have to figure this out yourself. And there, I think it's going to be very difficult. I don't think Israel really has the strength, and above all, it doesn't have the numbers of interceptors that it needs in order to withstand missile strikes and drone strikes from Iran. Anyway, he once more comes back to Israel in a kind of rather interesting way. Let me take a look at this. And he does this when he refers to the person that he admires so much, and that is Jolani. Now, if you recall, Jolani, let's see, if you recall, Jolani was the Al Qaeda figure who was hoisted into power by a combination of Israel and who knows, the British intelligence, the CIA, and everybody else. But he was Al Qaeda, who who among themselves overthrew the rather civilized government of Bashar al-Assad, and they put in place al-Jolani, the former al-Qaeda cutthroat, who's now the president of Syria. And here, Trump says, you know what, he's giving advice to Netanyahu, you know what, you don't seem to be very good at fighting against Hezbollah. Why don't you leave it to Jolani? I think he would do a better job than you could. So let's listen to this.
This was not the lifestyle that they were taught to have, but including an end to all Iranian aggression, and they're not going to be Iranian aggression, and an end to war and terror in Lebanon. So the Lebanon peace is something we'll have to work on a little bit. It's a very small piece of the puzzle, actually, but it still makes a lot of noise. The big deal is the Iran deal. That's where the money is, where the power was. But they have Hezbollah, and got to get that done one way or the other. We'll do it. I think Israel can do a much better job on it. Syria would love to do it. I was very responsible for the gentleman in Syria that's now the president of Syria. He's done a tremendous job. He's put that country together in a year and a half. Sort of like our country, a year and a half. It's pretty similar size. They said, please don't put him there. He's a very violent man. Al Qaeda. They said, well, I know one thing, a Boy Scout's not going to work. And he's actually done a very good job. He'd love to go in it. You know, Hezbollah is an enemy of his, and he'd go in it, but he wouldn't knock down buildings every time he hears there's somebody. He'd just go and get them with
No, no. let's just savor what he's doing here. He's saying, oh, he's comparing Israel unfavorably with Al Qaeda run, with Al Qaeda run Syria. He's saying, well, he would do a much better job. Jolani, Al Qaeda, and Trump makes no bones about it. He is Al Qaeda. He would do a much better job than Netanyahu. He wouldn't just knock down buildings the way Israel does. He would just go in and get Hezbollah. Let's just listen to that again. I mean, you can just the idea that he's comparing Al Qaeda favorably to Israel. Let's try. So watch this again.
The gentleman in Syria that's now the president of Syria, he's done a tremendous job. He's put that country together in a year and a half. Sort of like our country, a year and a half. It's pretty similar size. They said, please don't put him there. He's a very violent man. Al Qaeda. They said, well, I know one thing, a Boy Scout's not going to work. And he's actually done a very good job. He'd love to go in it. You know, Hezbollah is an enemy of his, and he'd go in it, but he wouldn't knock down buildings every time he hears there's somebody.
He wouldn't knock down buildings, right?
He'd just go and get them with precision. But I don't know that people want that. Maybe they don't. Maybe Lebanon doesn't. We have to be guided.
So there is, okay, well, I don't want to rely on Bibi. He's saying, let's send in Al Qaeda. I mean, Al Qaeda can do a better job than Israel. And it's very interesting, however, because he kind of blurts out what everybody has known. Al Qaeda, these are the people, these are the cutthroats, the brigands, the most horrible, evil terrorists in recent decades, funded incidentally by Saudi money. They're responsible not just for the 9/11 terrorist attacks, but of course they were responsible for innumerable terrorist attacks in Europe, in the UK, in France, Paris, remember, in 2015. So these are the same people. This is, he pretty much says, yeah, we put him into power. We got him into power. Al Qaeda, the people who were supposed to be fighting. We waged this whole global war on terror against Al Qaeda. Turns out it was a big fraud. We lied to the people that we were fighting Al Qaeda. In reality, Al Qaeda was working for us. Nothing new about that. I mean, Trump isn't blurting anything out. This was already said by Jake Sullivan. You remember Jake Sullivan's email to Hillary Clinton that's been published, when it says, well, Al Qaeda's on our side in Syria. So Trump is just simply saying exactly what Hillary Clinton also said. Yeah, Al Qaeda's on our side. So yeah, Al Qaeda. So on one side we have Al Qaeda, these people, these worst kind of jihadis on the Western payroll, as everybody has always suspected. They were always on the Western payroll. And they are fighting Hezbollah. And Hezbollah are the bad guys. You know, Al Qaeda's the good guys, Hezbollah are the bad guys. Um, so that, Trump just simply, blurts this out in public. And you see the way he said, "Well, a Boy Scout isn't going to do it," and there's that Commerce Secretary behind him. The good friend of Jeffrey Epstein, from Cantor Fitzgerald, smirking about the Boy Scout. Oh yeah, he's not a Boy Scout. He's our man, and our Al Qaeda man. But anyway, so Trump naturally, as I said, he deserves some credit for getting himself out of a mess that he had gone himself into. But the fact that he saw it was a mess, the fact that he realized he needs to act quickly to get himself out of it, is to his credit. We'll see, obviously, whether this, there's a lot of very dubious stipulations here, and I'm not at all sure they're going to be adhered to. But nonetheless, he has done that. Now, of course, Trump has come under a great deal of attack. First of all, he came under attack from Israel, and the Israeli government, has attempted to keep its peace, but nonetheless, there were stories that were planted in Axios that the Israeli government, Netanyahu, and of course all the members of the Israeli government are really, really pissed by this deal, and J.D. Vance at the news conference today was asked about this article that in Axios about these comments attributed to members of the Israeli government, and where they were expressing great dissatisfaction with Trump. So let's just watch J.D. Vance's response. Okay, here we are.
Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Jordan Conradson with the Gateway Pundit. I want to talk back to the Lebanon component of the
Sure.
deal. There's a report in Axios that Netanyahu's fuming over this. Israel doesn't feel bound to the MOU as it relates to Lebanon. If, as you mentioned, your frustration with Israel striking in Beirut, hitting apartment buildings, if that continues, could it torpedo the deal? And what would the U.S.'s response be to a broader war in Lebanon involving Israel and Hezbollah?
Yeah, well, I don't want to get into hypotheticals that could torpedo the deal, because I think the president's expectation is that all of our friends, the Israelis, the Arabs in the region, we're going to work together and actually see this deal to completion. Now, I saw the Axios report, that Netanyahu is fuming. That's not reflective of the conversations that I've had with him, but maybe he's saying something to somebody else that he's not saying to me. What I will say, and this does bother me, is that you've seen people within Bibi's cabinet who have come out and attacked the deal, and in some ways very personally attacked the president of the United States. And I guess my message to them would be twofold. Number one, Donald J. Trump is the only head of state in the entire world who is sympathetic to the nation of Israel at this moment in time. And he happens to be the head of state of the world's superpower. If I was in the cabinet of the Israeli government, I might not be attacking the only powerful ally that I have anywhere left in the entire world. And the second message I would give to some of those cabinet members, Bibi, to his credit, has not gone down this path, but to some of these cabinet members in Israel who are attacking the president of the United States, the other thing that I would say is that over the last 3 months, 2/3 of the defensive weapons that have protected your homeland have been built by American hands and paid for by American tax dollars. The problem for Israel is not Donald J. Trump. And anybody in Israel who thinks their biggest problem is the president of the United States needs to wake up and smell the reality of the situation that country is in. Thank you all.
All right, so he's saying something not wholly unreasonable. That Israel had better shut up, and Israel had better stop attacking Trump, because they may think that if they attack Trump, they're going to find better allies in the United States. But that's very unlikely, because if things unravel politically in the United States, then it's almost certain that Trump will be replaced by a Democrat. Leave aside the issue of the impeachment, but let's say Trump is impeached, removed from office, and let's say he's replaced by J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is certainly far less well disposed towards Israel than Trump has been. So that's at the very least, Vance makes clear that if you're counting on a leadership arising in the United States that will be more favorable to Israel than the current leadership is, then he's saying, well, you've got another thing coming. If the Democrats win overwhelmingly in November, Trump is impeached, and maybe so overwhelming is the Democratic victory, and so angry are the Republicans that Trump is convicted, removed from office, then, in the first stage, J.D. Vance becomes president. J.D. Vance is unlikely to be particularly friendly to Israel. But more seriously, in 2028, it's quite likely that the Democrats will recapture the White House. It's very unlikely, given the mood among Democrats, that they are going to be more favorably inclined towards Israel than Trump has been. I think that's why I think he's giving them a warning. You're attacking Trump, but don't think, if you're going to try and lobby in Washington, and I think they probably will try to lobby in Washington against Trump, don't think that that's somehow going to improve your situation. But anyway, that's exactly what's happening. So Israel's allies in Washington are indeed attacking this agreement, but they are in a difficult position, particularly those who are aligned with the Republicans, because the Democrats are just being opportunistic. I mean, what the Democrats are doing, they're doing the whole, oh, Trump is betraying Israel and so on. But the Democrats are they're playing the same game that the Republicans were playing in 2015. The Republicans, including Trump, of course, attacked the JCPOA because it was betraying Israel. And the Democrats are doing something similar now, again, betraying Israel. But of course, they're being dishonest. They're just trying to win political points and hoping that's going to count for them in November. And they're hoping that they're going to get more money from AIPAC as reward for attacking the MOU. So that's, if you think the Democrats are just being thoroughly opportunistic, but within the Republican Party, they are in a bind because they cannot go too strongly against Trump. Trump still has huge sway within the Republican Party, and if they try to mount a full-scale attack against Trump, that could just simply destroy their position entirely within the Republican Party. And that's why, for all the hysteria and the fulmination that we're getting from Ted Cruz or Mark Levin, they're very careful not to attack Trump. Anyway, here was the article from Axios, and this is the one that actually J.D. Vance was asked about. So Netanyahu fumes, allies rage over Trump's Iran deal, and there says Netanyahu was silent on Wednesday as President Trump released and signed the deal that Israeli officials see as a strategic and political disaster. And then Netanyahu promised the Israeli public total victory in Iran. He had to settle for Trump's MOU. And then Netanyahu stands alone internationally in his belief that the deal is a mistake and the war should have continued. Even the UAE, which has been the most hawkish of the Gulf states, decided to join the regional consensus in favor of the deal. In Washington, too, Netanyahu's allies in the GOP and in the media are reluctant to fully trash a deal that carries Trump's imprimatur. That's very important. In Washington, too, Netanyahu's allies in the GOP and in the media are reluctant to fully trash a deal that carries Trump's imprimatur. There will be no repeat of Netanyahu's address to Congress in 2015 to rally opposition to then President Obama's Iran deal. Netanyahu can't even go on cable news and bluntly oppose the deal unless he wants to fight with Trump. And he can't do that. This is very important why he can't do that. He's got an election. He has to have an election in Israel before October. And Trump is far more popular in Israel than Netanyahu is. Netanyahu is widely hated in Israel, but Trump is very popular. I think the Gaza deal they largely attribute to Trump, certainly not to Netanyahu. You remember that famous the crowd, when just before the signing of the whatever was it called, the 20-point plan or whatever, and Witkoff was there and Jared Kushner was there, and then Witkoff, he praised Trump, enormous, fantastic, huge cheers, and then he says, and who else contributed to this, the signing of this deal? Bibi Netanyahu. Loud boos. So no one was willing to give anything to Bibi on that. So Bibi really has a problem. He cannot go against Trump if he has any hope of winning the election and maybe staying out of prison. But I'm not sure exactly whether he really is facing jail. Anyway, then he says, instead of public denunciations, Israeli officials have been expressing deep concern about the deal in background briefings with Israeli reporters. Meanwhile, Netanyahu-aligned media outlets, most of which have been emphatically pro-Trump, have started to attack Trump and his team. One primetime host on Netanyahu-aligned Channel 14 called Vice President Vance a scumbag. Wow. And used an anti-Semitic slur to accuse Trump's envoys Witkoff and Kushner of selling out Israel for financial gain. I don't know what the anti-Semitic was. I don't know. Judas? I don't know. Anyway, Times of Israel says Vance, Israel must respect this peace process. And then speaking at the White House press conference on the U.S.-Iran memorandum of understanding, Vice President J.D. Vance comes down hard on Israeli strikes on Hezbollah in Beirut, noting the civilian death toll, calling them unacceptable, and suggesting they threatened to derail U.S.-Iran talks. Vance asserts that while Israel has a right to defend itself, it also must respect the peace process. And Vance's comments come after President Trump also lashed out about Israeli strikes on Beirut. And then he says, Israel has a right to defend itself, but fundamentally, The Israelis, just like everybody else, have to respect this peace process that is fundamentally good for them and good for the entire region. And then he continued with what the president gets very frustrated with sometimes is that we seem to be right on the cusp of a major breakthrough in the agreement, and then all of a sudden there's a major explosion that goes off in the civilian population center in Beirut, and a lot of people who have nothing to do with Hezbollah lose their lives. This is the vice president speaking. This isn't some human rights organization. This isn't the Electronic Intifada, the Young Turks, or anyone else. This is, all of which, we've been hearing this for years and years. This is the vice president openly says, the moment we're on the cusp of a major breakthrough in the agreement, suddenly there's a major explosion that goes off in the civilian population center in Beirut, and a lot of people who have nothing to do with Hezbollah lose their lives. Yeah, that's right. That's not acceptable. That's the sort of thing that we've asked for closer coordination so that we ensure it doesn't happen. And then here, our message to the Israelis, just as our message to everybody else, is fundamentally, we want this peace to be good for you. We do not want Hezbollah attacking Israel, but in order to ensure that happens, we have got to actually build the kind of regional framework that can cut off money to Hezbollah, cut off Iranian support for Hezbollah, and also ensure that Lebanon's territorial sovereignty is respected by all parties. And then here's Levin, and this is the point. You can see how he's quickly backtracking, not daring, after fulminating in tweet after tweet after tweet about this agreement. He wants to make clear that he has no intention of saying anything negative about Trump. This is the hysterical Israel firster, Levin. A few decades ago, when I was working in the Reagan administration as chief of staff to Attorney General Ed Meese, I argued strenuously against a deal with the congressional Democrats where the administration would agree to grant citizenship to 2.3 million illegal aliens in exchange for promised funds to better secure the border. President Reagan did as promised, but the Democrats reneged. Nevertheless, I will always adore President Reagan. He was truly a great president and did wonderful things for our country and around the world. I have my disagreements with the MOU, and I do not believe the Iranian regime will ever honor any agreement anyway, but I adore President Trump and always will. He is a great president, and he too is doing great things for our country and around the world. So I hate the MOU, but I adore President Trump, absolutely adore him. And then Ted Cruz, the Obama-Iran nuclear deal was designed to give Iran nuclear weapons, so to say that President Trump's efforts are just like Obama's is absurd. I do want to urge the president not to give up the victory. We have destroyed their military, and we should not fund the rebuild. And that's it. So you can see Ted Cruz and Lady Lindsay. They all make sure they do not say anything at all negative about Trump. If you want to continue to have a future within the Republican Party, they know that you don't go against Trump. The one other thing that I wanted to discuss, and I guess because we've spent so much time on this, I'll just mention it quite briefly. That is how the Europeans, and we talked about this a little bit the other day, but that the Europeans are now convinced, and maybe with reason. It's not immediately clear whether their faith in Trump is misplaced, but they're convinced that Trump is now on board with in massively enhancing support for Zelensky and Ukraine. They think that now that Iran's out of the way, Trump over Iran. He said, you're getting distracted, by other things. You need to be focused on Russia. You need to be focused on Ukraine. You're getting distracted by Iran. So that's what they wanted. And so at Evian during this week, they immediately kind of accosted Trump, congratulated him fulsomely. They hugged him. Wonderful, this great agreement you've got, fantastic. Brilliant, congratulations, magnificent performance. And in the meantime, hey, now that this war is off your plate, how about you send a hell of a lot more to Ukraine? And so we saw the other day about how the G7 statement declared that we're now really going to do so much more for Ukraine. So here's the G7 leaders' statement. We, the leaders of the G7, stand united in our unwavering support for Ukraine in defending its freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We reaffirm our solidarity with the Ukrainian population suffering from attacks on their critical infrastructure and cultural heritage. We commend Ukraine for its resilience and progress on the battlefield in recent months and emphasize that there is now a new momentum. Now, this is very important because this is the line that's coming from the Europeans, and we saw quite a lot of that today at yet another one of these EU Council meetings. That somehow Ukraine has momentum. It's all of it is just completely made up. I mean, there's no new momentum. Ukraine isn't doing suddenly particularly well in this war, but it's one of these things. If you keep repeating it, and then they have the echo chamber within the media, and suddenly everyone is just buzzing with this idea that, oh, Russia's losing this war, Ukraine's doing fantastically well. We need to send so much more by way of weaponry and money and everything else. But it's that conclusion, we need to send a hell of a lot more to Ukraine. That's irrespective of anything that's going on the battlefield, because where about a year or so ago they were saying that things aren't going well for Ukraine, Russia has the momentum. What's the conclusion? Well, we need to send more for Ukraine. But now they're saying, well, now things are really going well for Ukraine, so we need to send more. So the conclusion is always exactly the same, whatever the facts on the ground. But the idea that somehow things are really going well for Ukraine is made up. It's not based on any objective measurement at all, other than that Ukraine is now hitting targets deep inside Russia on a regular basis. That doesn't mean, of course, that the war is going particularly well. I don't. Then Russians say, "Oh, the war for Russia is going particularly well." I don't think that's going very well. I don't think there's very much movement, frankly, and there hasn't been much movement for quite a long time now. I mean, one has to be honest; there hasn't been much movement for some time. So the rest is just sort of made up, where Russia's on the march, that cliche. Now it's Ukraine's on the march, that cliche. There's no real factual basis for either assertion. But nonetheless, this was the buzzword at the G7, and then of course this is the buzzword at today's EU Council meeting, that somehow Ukraine's on the march. Now's the time really to apply the pressure on Russia. And so here we have this, with now a new momentum, and then to support and accelerate this new momentum, we agree to increase the delivery of air defense capacities, additional systems and interceptors, and long-range capabilities. We are also ready to consider extending to Ukraine the benefit of licenses to allow for an increase in Ukraine's military production. We stress the importance of energy resilience on the basis of the need for priorities expressed by Ukrainian authorities and so on. And then we commit to increase the pressure on the Russian war economy. In this context, we will strengthen our sanctions, including those on the oil and gas sectors. We consider this the right moment to proceed with additional measures, such as President Trump has delivered a deal that we support in reopening the Strait of Hormuz. So that was the statement by the G7. And then here, this is Macron, who seemed the host of this G7, went around declaring, even though Trump really gave no public indication, I mean, maybe he said something different in private, but he gave no public indication that somehow he's on board with this new plan to escalate involvement or escalate armaments deliveries to Ukraine. So he says G7 agrees there is no genuine willingness from Russia to make peace. So this is very interesting because, as we've discussed here many times, for quite a while now, we've been hearing from the Europeans that there needs to be negotiations. We Europeans have to be at the negotiating table. We need a place at the table. And we had Macron talking about how, well, one of these days he's going to pick up a phone and call Putin. But now you can see that this was always a ruse. There was never any serious intent behind it. Macron says, well, Russia's not serious about negotiations. By that, of course, he means Russia's not willing to accept our terms. Well, those are the terms that the Europeans have been insisting upon were, of course, terms of capitulation for Russia. Well, that was a non-starter. You can only force someone's capitulation if you're winning the war. And you can't really say NATO, Ukraine is winning the war. I mean, neither side is winning the war, but you can't just simply declare, well, we're winning the war. So the claim that Russia needs to capitulate is just completely made up. And they say, well, Russia's not willing to negotiate. They're not willing to accept our terms, which is basically unconditional Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. Anyway, so here is Macron said the G7 leaders agreed there was no genuine willingness from Russia to make peace in Ukraine after Moscow rebuffed offers from the United States and Europe to engage in talks. Now, this, of course, is typical France 24 media garbage. Russia has never rebuffed proposals to engage in talks. What they really mean is that Russia has rebuffed the demand that the Western powers have made, which is the immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Now, immediate unconditional ceasefire has never been any kind of condition for peace talks. You can absolutely have peace talks, and normally there have been peace talks taking place while the war continues. To insist on an unconditional ceasefire is to allow one side or another to get unilateral advantages by redeploying their forces, by upping the arms deliveries, and so on. So this is typical kind of France 24 Politico Guardian distortion by claiming, oh, Russia has refused to engage in talks. Totally untrue. And as we've discussed many times before, they did engage in talks in Minsk, and then, of course, they did engage in talks in Istanbul. They didn't accept the full and unconditional ceasefire that the NATO powers demanded in 2025. But it's so helpful that France 24 can just simply say that, President Trump, like all of us, simply acknowledged that there was no genuine willingness on Russia's part to discuss peace. Nowhere does Trump actually say that. I looked through all Trump's comments during the past few days, And Trump never said anything remotely that. So Macron is lying here. But again, the fact checkers are, asleep at the switch. They don't seem to. So where did Trump say that there was no genuine willingness on Russia's part to discuss peace? So Macron just made that assertion, and this is just reported as fact. G7 leaders agreed to increasing supplies of air defense equipment to Ukraine. They agreed to increase the pressure on the Russian war economy. And then Macron hailed a very deep change in the U.S. approach towards Ukraine, saying that President Trump had understood the Russian President Vladimir was not interested in peace. So again, no evidence for this. Trump, he had that long conversation with Putin on the phone on Sunday. And then subsequently, during the news conference, he said, it's terrible. Just said what he's always said. Terrible what's going on. So many people losing their lives. We need to bring it to an end. He said nothing more than that. President Trump, like all of us, simply acknowledged that there was no serious willingness on Russia's part to discuss peace. So, as I say, complete lies by Macron. And throughout the summit, which was attended by Zelensky, Trump took a harder line against Moscow, saying Russia had to seek a deal and showing impatience over the death toll on both sides. First of all, he's always shown impatience over the death toll on both sides. He didn't say Russia had to seek a deal and not Ukraine. This is, again, it's so helpful to have, media that serve as government news agencies. And then here's the Euro News. Ukraine may be the G7's biggest winner, emerging with a strong statement of support from Western leaders despite Zelensky's failing to secure a full bilateral meeting with Trump. Well, that's a shame. So after all the claims that Trump's on board, Trump wants this claim. Trump wants to say that Russia's not serious about negotiations. Zelensky failed to secure a bilateral meeting with Trump. G7 leaders pledged to accelerate deliveries of air defense systems, provide further support for Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and strengthen sanctions against Russia. They also said they were ready to consider granting Ukraine licenses for military production. Okay. And then while the US president merely said he would take a look at the idea, that still marks progress on his earlier outright dismissal of the possibility. And Trump also said Washington might soon reinstate sanctions on Russian oil and gas, which were temporarily waived in recent weeks. Now, we talked about that the other day, and Trump made some very, fairly innocuous comments. Basically not very non-committal. But you can see how you manufacture the news, you manufacture consent. And so all the media outlets keep repeating the same thing. Oh, the G7 is in full alignment on Russia and Ukraine. Trump is now on board. Trump has now accepted the G7's view of the war in Ukraine. And here it says Macron hails U.S. alignment with G7's shared commitment on Ukraine. Now remember, we had something similar last year when once again the Europeans put it out to the media that somehow Trump had agreed that unless Putin agrees to a full, immediate, unconditional ceasefire, unless Putin agrees to that, the United States and everybody else will impose sanctions on Russia. Remember they put that out, and we talked about this. And this is a total lie. Trump had never said anything of the sort. But they Merz and Macron, the Starmer, they all did this. Oh yeah, Trump has agreed to this. That unless Russia accepts full, immediate, unconditional ceasefire, then the United States will impose sanctions on Russia. And the media dutifully reported this. Dutifully reported that even though there was no evidence whatsoever in any of the things that Trump had said, that he intended to impose sanctions on Russia unless it accepted the ceasefire. So essentially, here we go again. Anyway, here we are. This is the Guardian. Emmanuel Macron said the whole of the G7, including the US, recognizes the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as he hailed a resynchronization of positions on the issue. The French president welcomed a deep change in the US approach, saying Donald Trump and all the leaders of the G7 at Evian-les-Bains understood that Vladimir Putin was not interested in peace. President Trump, like all of us, simply acknowledged that there was no serious willingness on Russia's part to discuss peace. Nowhere has Trump said that. Where is it? Show us the quote where Trump said that. Macron repeatedly emphasized a shared commitment to making progress on this issue, which he described as a very profound shift in a remobilization of the G7. The annual G7 meeting brings blah, blah, blah. And then, and then it says, challenged on whether Trump could be trusted to follow through on a commitment to consider further sanctions against Russia, Macron said, I have always trusted President Trump. When he has made commitments to us, he has always done what he said he would do. But he has not made a commitment to consider further sanctions against Russia. So this is just make stuff up as you're going along. Macron's belief that Trump was re-engaging with the Ukraine issue was echoed by Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, who said he believed that Trump had shifted to a more realistic understanding of how this war will develop. What the hell does that even mean? More realistic understanding of how this war will develop. And then here, Politico, how Macron won Trump round the G7, and then overlooking Lake Geneva at Monday's dinner, the assembled G7 leaders discussed the Middle East at length and strategically lavish praise on Trump's deal with Iran and so on. They explained to Trump altogether that Zelensky was winning because Russia cannot cross the front line and is even losing territory. So again, they were hoping to fool Trump, and they admit this here. They were basically hoping to fool him. Think, hey, we're going to just accost him in our meeting and tell him Zelensky's winning, Ukraine's winning. Hey, here are the data. Ukraine's winning, and then think, Trump is stupid enough to buy into that. Last week, Trump is stupid enough to buy into the idea that Russia was attacking NATO territory with drones. So now the new one is, they're going to sell Trump another bill of goods that Ukraine's winning this war. And Russia has continued to hit civilian sacred sites. Diplomats noted that there is, of course, no guarantee that Macron's efforts this week won't be undone by a single phone call between Trump and the Russian President Putin. Well, there is no guarantee for the simple reason that Trump is just not on board for any of this, that Macron has just simply lied about the whole thing. So yeah, it could well be undone because Trump is not on board with this nonsense. And then G7, they're back for more sanctions, and the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, there's been a change in the U.S. position on discussion in Ukraine. We consider this position to be more realistic regarding the situation on the battlefield. And here we have the story in Bloomberg, which may well be true, and whereby the United States, it does seem to have signed on, maybe, to manufacturing missiles in Ukraine or manufacturing missiles somewhere in Europe that will be used in Ukraine. And here's the story in Bloomberg. President Trump is planning on asking U.S. defense companies to produce weapons under license in Europe and Ukraine. According to officials familiar with the discussions, they would like to be able to do it. We'll take a look at it. Trump told reporters. And then here, Ukraine needs air defense capabilities, in particular interceptor missiles to stop Russian ballistic missiles, which only the U.S. can make. But with U.S. having burned through stocks in Iran and the time required to boost production, Trump told allies he'd look into licensing possibilities. The specific licenses in question will be discussed in detail among the participating countries, Merz said on Wednesday. This does indeed involve the granting of comprehensive licenses by American companies to European manufacturers. And then France's Macron confirmed that Trump insisted on the mobilization of the American defense industry and the capacity to supply such equipment. And so, yeah. And then the U.S. has continued to deliver air defense capabilities paid for by Europe and Canada through a NATO coordinated mechanism. So we'll see whether that happens. There's no question. There's been this war continuing with this missile and drone production in Ukraine, missile and drone production in Europe. Whether American companies will do it in Europe, and particularly on very sensitive military equipment, and thus essentially European manufacturers will have access to American military secrets and will therefore then be able to produce their own equipment, and therefore will have no further need to purchase these missiles from the United States. That I have to say, I'm a little bit dubious about that. The Americans are just going to hand over these these highly military technology secrets to the Europeans, and so but it's very important when you look at these story after story after story, how particularly in the European media industry is completely owned lock, stock, and barrel by the European governments, and particularly by the EU. They get a lot of money from the EU, and therefore they are on hand, and their survival depends on this. They're on hand to peddle EU propaganda. So the EU propaganda of the day is that Trump somehow agreed with the EU take on Ukraine and was suddenly on board with massive escalation in Ukraine. And Macron says this, and then Carney, who's, he's always there to echo this line. Remember he showed up at the European Political Community meeting in Armenia a few weeks ago. So that's the way you always you want to kind of create this fantasy world. And as I said, the one that they said, oh, Trump is about to impose sanctions on Russia. So you try and create this in the hope that once you have to make this a reality, Trump will indeed impose sanctions. Anyway, let's now go to our locals board. These are the members of our locals community who day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, year in, year out, keep the Gaggle community going. And in particular, they make sure that the dogs are reasonably content and not dissatisfied. And as I always say at this moment in the conversation, if you want to talk to me, if you want to address comments to me, if you want me to answer any of your questions, please join our locals community, and please, these are great. We have really interesting, really talented, very, very smart people who are members of our community. So you benefit greatly from their accumulated knowledge and wisdom and insights. And above all, you'll keep the Gaggle community going. You'll be able to keep the journalism that we do here going. And added bonus, you can always then talk to me. You can always address any comments and questions to me. Anyway, how do you join? Thegaggle.locals.com. Anyway, so here, our first question comes from Danaki, who is one of our most prolific posters, always has really interesting items that he puts up on our board, and really interesting stuff that I miss. And so I'm really grateful for everything that Danaki does. Anyway, he says, okay, so let's continue with insights into George's family history, which is more interesting than the bland fakery of today's news. Your mother was a Russian or from the Soviet Union, right? Did she learn Hungarian, or did they talk to you in Russian? How well did your parents manage to transition to English? And did they know it before leaving? What languages did you speak at home growing up in Britain? Okay, so that's an interesting set of questions. My mother was indeed Russian from the Soviet Union. My father, who had lived most of his life in the Soviet Union, he was born in the Soviet Union. He came from this famous Hungarian communist family. His uncle was, one of the founders of the Hungarian Communist Party. He was, one of the leaders of the Tanács Köztársaság, the Hungarian Soviet Republic of 1919. And the Hungarian communists who took part in that, those who were not executed or killed and tortured, those who weren't, ended up in prison under Horthy's dictatorship. But Horthy came to an agreement with the Bolshevik regime. The Bolsheviks returned prisoners of war who were still in Russia years after the World War I had come to an end. But in return, the Soviet Union took all the Hungarian communists. So my father's family, my father wasn't alive yet, and my father's family, which had been in prison in Hungary, was then shipped to the Soviet Union. And that's where my father was born. Now, he traveled, as my father, that is, he traveled in Europe, and particularly in England during the 1930s with his father. So his father, who was a Hungarian communist, who was the younger brother of the great Tibor Samuelis. So his father, who was also called George, he was my grandfather, he was working for the Comintern. And that's why he was able to travel around the world, and why he was able to spend time in England. Quite what he was doing on behalf of the Comintern, my father really never knew. Obviously, he was very young. His father didn't exactly share these kinds of secrets with his child. But anyway, that's where my father really acquired an amazing knowledge of English, and then my grandfather, he was forced to return to the Soviet Union, and then he was duly arrested and executed in 1937 during the Great Purge, and which particularly hit all the foreign communists, including, of course, the Hungarian communists. So he was executed. It was in 1937. My father was 12 at the time. And then, of course, he under Stalin, Stalin played for keeps. So he wasn't that, if somebody was arrested and tried and executed for political crimes, then the family itself was also punished. So the family was also banished, sent into exile. So then my father lived for some years in exile. um, until the start of World War II, lived in Siberia. Um, then that was lifted, and he was able to come back to Moscow. But in any case, he he served in the Allied Control Commission during World War II, during which time he was assigned to Hungary. And then after his assignment in Hungary, he returned to the Soviet Union. That's where he met my mother, and then of course my father in turn was sentenced to the Gulag during the sort of the crackdown again on various foreigners who were living in the Soviet Union, the rootless cosmopolitans, and so on. So my father was sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag. That was in 1950. But he managed to get released after he was sentenced for 8 years. He was released after 18 months, um, largely through the intervention of the leader of Hungary, of communist Hungary at the time, which was Matyas Rákosi. So because Rákosi and my father's family had been, rather friendly, so he made a real pitch. Evidently, it was successful pitch to Stalin or whoever made the decision. But he was released after 18 months and sent packing with his wife and my sister. I wasn't alive yet. My sister, he was sent packing to Hungary. That was early 1953, and that's where he really lived for the next 10 years of his life with my mother. Now, my mother, of course, spoke Hungarian fluently. When exactly she learned Hungarian, I've never been sure. I mean, whether she had already acquired a Hungarian knowledge before she arrived in Hungary, or she kind of acquired it as just through daily interactions in Hungary. I don't know, but by the time I have recollection of her, earliest recollections of her, she was already a fluent Hungarian speaker. Now she was a linguist, so she had a real talent for languages. So then, anyway, then afterwards, went to England, but both of my, as I said, my father's English was outstanding. I mean, he spoke really without a trace of an accent. He wrote fluently in English, and my mother also. Her English was really great. Now, in terms of what language I spoke at home, I spoke Russian at home. That was it. So the language was Russian. Um, quite why it was Russian, but I wasn't always certain. So I spoke Hungarian outside the home, in school and so on, but at home I was prohibited from speaking Hungarian. So it was always, the rule was, at home you only spoke in Russian, and that was true for some years in England as well. But gradually, I kind of spoke both languages at home in England, both English and Russian, never Hungarian. So, so really, after I left Hungary, I never spoke Hungarian with anybody. I never spoke Hungarian with my family, and and that was it. So I never had any opportunity to speak Hungarian. So yeah. But when you say in terms of was the transition easy? Yeah, I mean it was pretty easy, but I also think that I mean my father grew up with a very idealized picture of England. I mean, let's say he remembered the England of the 1930s, where he was there a child. He spent some time in England as a child. He attended, Bertrand Russell's famous progressive schools. I mean, they used to have these progressive schools in England, so he attended that. And he kind of remember, it's like when you look at those movies about England in the 1930s, it looks like a pretty nice place. So I can imagine. So when, during the years that my father, indulged his dreams of going to England, he had in mind that England was still the England of the 1930s. So, but of course, the England that he came to, of the 1960s, was very different, which he didn't particularly like. But he still, there was enough of the idealism in his mind that he tended to overlook all of the shortcomings, or he willfully. I don't think he exactly overlooked them, but he willed himself to overlook the shortcomings of England of the 1960s. That's the 1960s. What do you think of the England of today, the England of two-tier care? I find it painful to think about. And I can't stand that. I mean, to me, like the England of the 1960s, I have this kind of similar, somewhat idealistic picture of that era. It wasn't that great, but it was a hell of a lot better than what we have now. I mean, so then but if you think of the England of those days, let's say the England of Harold Wilson, um, it was still a pretty nice country. Whereas what you have now is just so horrific, such a disgusting police state, so antithetical to any idea that somehow England is the embodiment of liberalism and political freedom uh, and civilization and good manners and people liking and helping one another, all the things that one used to attribute to England. That's all gone. I mean, it's like you don't recognize it. You remember, when you think of that great book by A.G. MacDonald, England There, England. And we should have that at some point in our book club. England There, England, or George Orwell's. Was it called The Lion and the Unicorn? That England isn't there. So, um, but there were still traces of it. In the England that I remember. I mean, maybe it was in the 1930s. It was clearly it was more obviously present, but it was still, I think, present in the 1960s. But the nasty police state of two-tier care, that doesn't have any of that. So, so that the transition was still relatively easy. I don't think such a transition would be possible today. Anyway, thank you so much for that question, Danaki. And then Stone River, thank you so much for your generosity. Stone River says, George, that segues well to a question I've been wanting to ask you for a while. What explains your Shakespearean-like breadth of vocabulary and colorful expression? No blushing, please. Voluminous reading as a child. Well, that does almost cause blushing. I guess so. I think that um, I think I spent some time in England cultivating good writing and good speaking and a good style of conversation, and as I've said before, I did spend some years at the Times Literary Supplement, and while I didn't exactly handle the poetry part of the paper, and I didn't exactly review the fiction part of the paper, and I certainly didn't review I didn't um, work on the history of English literature part of the paper. I did pick up a number of things during that time, and so I did imbibe some of the atmosphere of the value of literature in general and the glories of English literature in particular. So therefore I kind of learned even then to distinguish the dismal quality of life in contemporary England, and this was in the 1980s. So life in contemporary England distinguish that from the greatness of English literature. And I always had that in mind, and I have it in mind even now. I mean, if I think about like what do I enjoy reading for pleasure, I almost always reach for some works of English literature. So even whether it's P.G. Wodehouse or Evelyn Waugh on a kind of in terms of more recent English literature, or the classics, Austen, Dickens, Trollope, I always have in mind, if there's one thing that does me intellectually good, it does my writing and speaking good. It's always great writing in English literature. The masters of English prose. So I've managed to retain that. So I think that's what kept me propelled. That hey, there's a distinction. Two tier care, the awful way they mangle language. It's just an embarrassment listening to the way the British today speak, with a literature that was really unsurpassed. I mean, you say, well, whatever else you say about the English, they managed to produce literature that no one else has come close to producing. I mean, the Russians are great, certainly, but just in terms of the majesty of their prose and the majesty of their sort of productivity, I think the English pretty much there on their own. Anyway, I hope that answered the question. Thank you so much, Stone River. And then Robert says, thank you so much, Robert, for your generosity. And then Robert says, in regard to the MOU, it's important to note that peace means two very different things in the market society versus the political society. In the market society, peace is an economic good. Yeah. Safe, pleasant, peaceful places are worth much more than those in conflict. Yes. Not so in the political society, where peace is merely a lull in the battle, while each side rearms and works up new schemes to restart the war and prepares to resume the battle at a later date. And that's really interesting. Because I mean, it goes back to something we've talked about, I think maybe last time or the time before, that in the one hand, you do have the notion that you have a kind of, markets where in theory, everybody should be in the business of looking after their own well-being. And everybody can, everyone, gets something, and everybody realizes that if I contribute something to the common good, then somebody else is going to contribute something, and I will derive the benefit from that, and he will derive the benefit from my contribution, and so on. And so everything should work itself out, but for some reason it doesn't really do so. And if one thinks about there've been eras in the past when contemporary writers thought, we basically moved to the situation where there's no reason for any conflict. I mean, everybody's getting rich, everybody's getting something. Fundamental conflicts can be managed because there's, everyone thinks about reasonableness and precisely stability. You want stability because only if you have stability can people invest money, can people actually produce and consume goods. And the easiest way of stability is, having reasonably functioning courts and so on. So if you think about the last few years before the Great War, the 1914 war, most people thought that the fundamental need for war had been eliminated. There was really no reason for war because countries have become smart enough to figure out how they can live with one another, make compromises, and realize that it's just as in ordinary society, we kind of realize that it's in everyone's interest to cooperate, because only if everybody cooperates, then we can all prosper. And so when the Great War happened, that came as a little bit of a surprise. That went against the contemporary wisdom of the time, which is that the need for war had been abolished. And of course, we had the era which after that war was similarly, people thought that there was never going to be another war. That was the war to end all wars. There was never going to be another war. That turned out to be a dud. And then something similar, I think, happened um, during the sort of the heyday of the Fukuyama moment. So that was from about 1989 onwards. 89, I think. I guess probably through the launch of the bombing of Yugoslavia. So during those 10 years, it also seemed that, well, everybody's agreed to liberal democracy is the way forward, and there are no basic disagreements on that, which means we have a liberal political system. Everybody agrees on markets. Everybody agrees that you can have free markets. You can have a little bit of regulation. But fundamentally, everybody realizes that you can't mess around with the fundamental human needs. We just know what is successful, we know what isn't successful, and therefore that kind of the liberal market society is the most successful kind of society there is, and therefore all challenges have been beaten off, and mankind will just march on into happy tranquility. Well, that didn't happen. That didn't last for very long. So you know, I probably, I don't think, um, I don't think that's really ever going to happen. I think there's always going to be fundamental conflicts. There will always be a group of powers that will seek to seize advantages at the expense of someone else, and thereby threaten stability. And so, if one thinks about what happened to the Fukuyama moment, I would say, I mean, maybe there are other explanations, but I would say the reason why the Fukuyama moment didn't last came about through Western hubris. The West decided that they would force their society, their way of thinking, they're on everybody else. Yes, history culminates in the market democracy, but we'll just speed things up along the way. We'll just push everybody else forward. So we'll expand NATO, even though a lot of countries don't want it. We'll expand the EU, even though it creates conflict as a consequence. But we can just move along because we're in a hurry. And I think that's what ended the Fukuyama moment. And I think that's why all these moments fundamentally don't last for very long. Anyway, I think there's just just a few random thoughts on that, Robert. Thank you so much, Robert, as always, for raising the tone of the discussion. So thank you, Cynthia. Always very good to see you, Cynthia. Cynthia, our film scholar, our film expert, our resident writer on cinema history, a resident writer on cinema production, who graces our pages with very learned and very thoughtful insights and observations on film, and above all, provides us with really interesting background information on the movies that we screen in our film club. And the last 2 weeks, we've had films from Eastern Europe, the communist Eastern Europe era. We had Night Train last week, and then this week we have Roman Polanski's Knife in the Water. In both cases, Cynthia really offered some, truly fantastic insights, and both about the films, but also about the milieu that that produce these films, and something also about the history of East European cinema. So really interesting observations by Cynthia. So please join the gaggle.locals.com, see these really good films, and enjoy Cynthia's very erudite commentary on these films. So now we've got a new film poll. I hope people are going to vote. Please vote. The theme is, because of the World Cup, international sporting events and cinema. So there's some football films, there are films about the Olympics, and there's even Grand Prix. So if you haven't voted, please vote. So it should be fun. Anyway, so Cynthia asks, Sebastian Gorka, oh Christ, what a disgusting thought. Sebastian Gorka fits a post-World War II spy mold where the West used Eastern European assets. His praise of his grandfather fighting Russians mirrors how Intel networks hid the Nazi past of radical Ukrainians raised in the UK with intelligence ties. Gorka failed in Hungarian politics as a planted agent. He then recast himself as a US terror expert on Fox News. Now, this fluid operator who even sold Zelensky shirts on his site is set to head Trump's counterterrorism center. Your thoughts? Yes, Gorka was born in the UK. His family left Hungary in 1956. And he sounds foreign. That's what's odd. I mean, he was actually born in the UK, but he doesn't sound like like an Englishman. And he did indeed come from a very intensely anti-communist family. Whether they were collaborators with the Nazis or not, I don't know. There have been accusations along those lines. Quite possible. I mean, without question. I mean, there was the Nazis who invaded Hungary in March of 1944. And then in October 1944, they overthrew Horthy and replaced him with the Arrow class, the Nyilas party, and to fight off the Red Army, who had already entered Hungary. Quite what role his family played in all of this, whether they were Nyilas, whether they fought alongside the Nyilas, I'm not sure. So I want to be careful what I say. I don't want a lawsuit. All I would say is that there have been lots of questions about his family, and his father, I think, did spend time in prison in communist Hungary, and whether that was because of the collaboration with the Nazis, we'd have to look into that. I mean, so there's this. It's a very murky past, to say the least, that the Gorka family took part in. Now, when he grew up in England, he evidently decided that he would somehow take part in Hungarian politics. He did try to join Fidesz, and then of course he got himself a PhD at Corvinus University. It used to be known as the Karl Marx University. Um, you don't have you when you think about you grow up in the UK, and UK, whatever else you can say about it, they certainly have plenty of very good universities. So if you want to get a PhD, there's plenty of good universities in the UK where you can get a PhD. Um, when you go to Corvinus and decide you're going to get your PhD in Corvinus University, then you think there's obviously some kind of an agenda there, and his dissertation is a kind of was on a nonsensical subject like radical Islamic terrorism. It's again, it's a non-existent subject, radical Islamic terrorism. What the hell is that? But it is a phenomenon of people going to foreign countries with money and basically buying themselves a degree, buying themselves a PhD. And remember Gaddafi's son, who managed to get himself a PhD at the London School of Economics, and then of course the London School of Economics withdrew after the overthrow of Gaddafi. They withdrew the PhD that they had awarded his son, and particularly as they had awarded the PhD after Gaddafi himself had lavished a very handsome donation on the London School of Economics. So there's a lot of money changing hands, but you get a PhD, and thereby you get to be called Dr. Sebastian Gorka. And so that's his Dr. Sebastian Gorka, but his doctorate was from Corvinus University. Now, you're right that Fidesz kept its distance from him, but something similar happened in the UK. I think he tried to build some kind of a career in counterintelligence in the UK, which didn't really work out for him. Now, at this stage, I'm not and I'm certainly not an expert on Gorka's family history. At this stage, he seems to have entered Bannon world. So Bannon was the editor of Breitbart, and I think he ran Breitbart London. And I think that was the moment when Bannon, I think, hired Gorka to work for Breitbart London, and that was Gorka's entree into the sort of right-wing world in the United States. And I think then he came to the United States. I think he married an American woman, and yes, he was on Fox News, but more important that he became a talk show host and one of these commercial right-wing talk radio. So that's where he acquired the notoriety, and somehow his blowhard personality appealed to Trump. I was very disappointed that Trump hired him. I thought Trump would have more sense than to hire Sebastian Gorka, but he did. Evidently, Bannon pushed him. Oddly enough, many of the people around Bannon really didn't like Gorka at all. Like Jack Posobiec and many others. They just thought he was a fraud and a blowhard and completely reckless and irresponsible, and they thought that he's the worst kind of person for Trump to hire because he's an interventionist. He's a rabid Russophobe. He's a war hawk. Not to mention a war whore. And he represents everything that MAGA and America First is supposed to be against. And so they people like Posobiec were against Gorka being hired, but somehow Trump liked him, or whether Bannon pushed him, I'm not sure. But he was hired to work at the National Security Council. Curiously enough, during Trump's first term, he was also hired. And that came when Trump offered Bannon a position. He was a chief strategist. Bannon brought in Gorka, and then when Bannon was fired, Gorka was immediately fired with him. But this time, Gorka came in by himself. Bannon wasn't hired to be in the second um, Trump term, and so anyways, he's set to head Donald Trump's counterterrorism. Yes, the worst possible person to do so. Um, and and then anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. I hope I've given I've told you what I know of him. I think he's one of the worst people imaginable, and why Trump would go to all the trouble of saying, well, we're not going to hire Mike Pompeo, and I'm not going to hire Nikki Haley, and I'm not going to hire Mike Pence, but you're going to hire Sebastian Gorka. I mean, so that's just, it doesn't make any sense at all. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then hold on, Robert has a quote from P.G. Woodhouse. I need to read this. Robert says, "She looked as if she had been poured into her clothes and." Let me read this out. She looked as if she had been poured into her clothes and had forgotten to say when. It's P.G. Woodhouse. I'm not sure where that's from, but I love that line. She looked as if she had been poured into her clothes and had forgotten to say when. That's classic Woodhouse. I mean, he really is. He is one of those delightful masters of the English language. And fortunately, he was amazingly productive. He lived a very long life, much of it outside the United Kingdom. Much of it actually lived in the United States. But he produced really an amazing amount of really high quality literature. So she looked as if she had been poured into her clothes and had forgotten to say when. P.G. Woodhouse. Anyway, Aristotle says, thank you so much, Aristotle. I really appreciate your generosity. Aristotle says, in an ideal world, would Trump be prosecuted by an international court for his obviously illegal attack on Iran? Should there be a real United Nations which has the teeth to prosecute cases between nations? Well, the simple answer to that is that there's never been a consensus on the issue of aggressive war. I mean, if you recall, at the Nuremberg trial, the crime of all crimes, the first crime that the Nazis had been charged with was crime against peace. And then after crime against peace, they had, of course, crimes against humanity, violations of the laws of war. But the first crime was the crime against peace. Now, that, of course, became very, very controversial. And many people criticized the Nuremberg trials because they say, well, you're making post facto law. It had never been declared illegal to wage aggressive war. There'd never been any law passed to which other countries had signed on to that prohibited waging aggressive war. And the Nuremberg judges came up with all sorts of very unconvincing explanations to say, yes, that was accepted law because look at the League of Nations, and then look at the Charter of the League of Nations, and then look at the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war. But of course, it was nonsensical because those are not binding laws. But anyway, there never has been. Now, the International Criminal Court, which has no international standing because it has no affiliation with the United Nations, unlike the International Court of Justice. But so the ICC originally, when they drew up the Rome Statute, decided to abandon the project of waging aggressive war as something that they can prosecute, because they knew that originally they wanted the United States to be a part of the Rome Statute. And the Clinton administration seemed interested or pretended to be interested to be a part of the ICC. But in order to keep the Americans on board, they said, no, we're not going to have crimes against peace as part of the statute. So we had genocide, we had crimes against humanity, violation of the laws of war, but not crimes against peace. Now, after that, of course, the United States withdrew its signature from the Rome Statute and so on. And then other countries, of course, Russia also withdrew its signature, and then others never even joined to begin with, China, India, and so on. What the Europeans have now done, or rather, what the ICC then did is through I think the Kampala Protocol. I think that's what it's called. Kampala Protocol is that, well, we will have waging aggressive war as part of our statute, but only for those countries that specifically has signed on to the Kampala protocol, whatever it was called. And then, in other words, they explicitly recognize waging aggressive war as a crime. So that was added on or tacked on to the Rome Statute and the ICC. Now, that didn't really get very far because by then already most of the great powers, Russia, United States, and so on, had already, either never ratified the Rome Statute or basically withdrew their signature from the Rome Statute, so it didn't really matter. But the Europeans, who were desperate to prosecute Russia for waging an aggressive war against Ukraine, decided, well, we can't do it through the ICC because, first of all, Russia's not a signatory, but they could get around that because Ukraine is, and then Ukraine has in fact asked the ICC to investigate and prosecute Russia. But they couldn't do anything about the waging aggressive war because the Kampala, it's very explicit that you have to actually sign on to the Kampala protocol to be able to be prosecuted for waging an aggressive war. So they said, okay, well, we can't use the ICC. What we'll do is we'll set up our own tribunal specifically targeting against Russia. I mean, so this is the level at which you get to this lunacy that the EU, which it pretty much now admits is a party to the conflict, the EU is going to set up its own tribunal specifically for the purpose of trying Russia for waging an aggressive war. I mean, what kind of a nonsense is that? What kind of a legal validity does that have? It doesn't. But nonetheless, it's going forward. They're allocating money for this, and they're doing all kinds of legal research, and they're going to actually, presumably, issue indictments against Putin for waging an aggressive war. So what I would say is that this is a fool's errand. Anyone who kind of wants to take these international courts seriously and these international tribunals seriously is engaging in a fool's errand. You're only creating the basis for putting on trial the people that you don't really want put on trial. So the people who are saying, yeah, fantastic, let's put Israel on trial. Well, okay, fine. What happens then? Okay, Israel is not going to go on trial, but you're setting up the tribunal that's going to try and put Russia on trial. You're helping to set up the tribunal that's going to put China on trial for the treatment of Uyghurs. When you start down this road of tribunals and courts, it's all a question of whose ox is being gored. I don't think any of us should be engaged in any way in lending any credence or legitimacy to this project of creating fake courts to put on trial those we deem our political enemies. It's a bad idea, and Nuremberg was a bad idea. It made some serious mistakes, and it's kind of bedeviled the world ever since. So the idea that we can have this wonderful trial where we convict the people we don't like while we absolve ourselves of any crime. And I think Nuremberg did that, and that's why I think Nuremberg was misconceived and was seen even at the time to be a misconceived project. Anyway, thank you so much. I think my time is up, well past time. So thank you so much, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for so many interesting questions and comments and observations. As I said, please join the Gaggle, the gaggle.locals.com. Enjoy our very, very smart people, all the really outstandingly talented Gagglers who post regularly and provide us with so many interesting comments. And you can watch the films, listening to the Gaggle Music Club. Enjoy Cynthia's learned commentary, and please vote in the latest poll on movies and international sporting events. Until next week, next Monday, we're going to have the joint podcast with Peter, which is 10 a.m. East Coast time on Monday, and then 3 p.m. East Coast time on Tuesday. Please join me for my solo live stream. Until then, all the best. Good night. See you.